Good morning. We are breezing through the Old Testament. Next quarter, starting in June, we're going to breeze through the New Testament. But right now, we're going to focus on 5 books, the books of poetry. Sometimes we call them the books of wisdom, but we know them all as Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. If we were to try to study these books in any detail today, we'd be in big trouble. And what I am going to do is survey them. That's what we've been saying we're going to do, and sometimes I've been getting a little caught up in the details. So I don't want to do that today. I have gone through a couple of these slides here at the beginning with you before, so I won't spend a lot of time on them, but I'll remind you that literature can be divided up into 2 basic categories, and one is prose, the other is poetry. And what we're looking at are the books of poetry, and that would make sense. Prose, what is it? Well, it's basically ordinary conversation. That's what prose is, ordinary talk, without being prettied up and made fancy. Why is this important? Because 1/3 of the Bible is poetry, and you don't read it like narrative or stories. It's different. The word prose simply means prosaic, ordinary. It just means ordinary. But when you start bringing in poetry, it's different, isn't it? How many of you like to curl up with a mystery novel or some nonfiction? Yeah, you're reading a biography and that just really excites you. How many of you like to curl up with a book of E.S. Eliot poetry? Not me. I mean, just say what you mean, okay? I don't have to sit there and try to figure it out. However, poetry is powerful. And I think we all know the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, a poem is able to say something with such impact that prose or narrative can't. Or if it did, it would take it a whole lot longer. Poetry is powerful. It is artistic. Of course, narrative is as well. I'm not suggesting that at all. It's just different. And again, I know some of you are going to remember this when we were studying the Psalms a few months ago. But here is a beautiful classic poem. I think Josh was just telling his wife this poem last night, as a matter of fact, whispering in her ears. Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. Tell me about this poem. I've labeled it A, B, C, D. We've got 4 lines. So right there, it's different from narrative because we're dividing it up into lines. But tell me about these lines. Maybe you remember us talking about this before. Number 1, poems, in English mostly, they rhyme. So what are the rhyming words here? Red and sweet? And no? How about blue and you? So only lines B and D rhyme. They rhyme with each other. Sometimes do you see poems where the A line and the C line will also rhyme with each other? Okay. What else? What else do you observe about these 4 lines? This little poem. Okay, the meter, the number of syllable. Roses are red. That's 4 syllables. Violets are blue. Sugar is sweet. And so are you. Hey! That's kind of neat, isn't it? Do you think that's on purpose? Absolutely. The great author of this little line, whoever that was, did that on purpose. What else? So that's we've got B and D rhyming with each other. We've got all 4 lines with the same number of syllables. What else? How about the imagery? Okay, A and B go together because roses and violets are both flowers. What about sugar? Sugar's not a flower, but it is sweet. We can understand that. We can appreciate something simple like that. And to paraphrase Jesus, I'll say, if you cannot understand this little poem, how will you understand all the other poems? Here's this cute little poem. It does help us, I hope, and that's why we went through it, to appreciate the artistry that is in Scripture. Here is a prose version. This is narrative in 2 Samuel 12 when David is confronted with his sin with Bathsheba. This is what he says: I have sinned against the Lord. Is that poetic? It might be epic because of the impact it has on David's life, but no, it's not particularly poetic. How about these lines here from Psalm 51? David wrote this psalm. Do you remember what the superscription on the psalm says? When did David write Psalm 51? After he was confronted by Nathan about his sin. Now, in 2 Samuel 12, it says, this is how David responded: I have sinned against the Lord. How does David express it in poetic form? Very different, isn't it? And yet, he's getting the same point across, isn't he? I'm just picking at a couple of verses. Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. You look at lines A and B, you see the word transgression and sin. Let me highlight that for you. They parallel each other. And that's how Hebrew poetry works. You've got these lines and there are parallels. What about rhyming? Is there any rhyming going on here? Not in English. How about in the original Hebrew? Do the lines rhyme? No, that is not a character. It is rare when you happen to have some words with the similar endings. Rhyming is not a feature of Hebrew poetry. It's just not. And the way they bring out the parallels really drives it home. And you could almost, and we don't want to do this, you could just skip out the second line, the B and the D lines. Would it still make sense? I know my transgressions, against you, you only have I sinned. And if we didn't have lines B and D, we would still understand, wouldn't we? Why do we need lines B and D? Well, one, they're inspired. Two, the way Hebrew poetry works, the second line, between the two, expands. It helps elaborate on and fill it out. It's kind of like a relay, but better than a relay. You got the baton and you pass it on to the one runner and they take off with it. That's kind of like what B is doing. A is handing the baton and saying, okay, we're going to go further with this. I know my transgressions. Oh, no, it's more than that. My sin, transgression, sin, I don't just know it, it's ever before me. What's the difference between knowing and your sin being ever before you? You never, ever forget. It's not one thing to say, hey, David, do you remember when you committed that sin with Bathsheba? Yeah, I remember that. But what David is saying in poetic form is it's more than that. So line B extends what is being expressed in line A. What about C and D? Against you and you only have I sinned. And he elaborates now on what sin is. Evil in your sight. We are not going to be able to look in any detail, much detail. We're going to look at Job a little bit because we hardly talk about the book of Job. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. I wish I could tell you who wrote the book of Job. A lot of speculation about who wrote it. What about the Psalms? Who is primarily accredited with the Psalms? David, absolutely. He is the sweet psalmist of Israel. And particularly in the opening two books of Psalms, you've got 73, the first 73 Psalms. Most of them are written by David. You have some other authors as well. Who are some of the others? Do you remember? Asaph. We don't know much about Asaph, but apparently he was one of the musicians. Korah, the sons of Korah, as they're identified. There are some individual authors who wrote maybe one or two. Moses, Psalm 90. Solomon, did he write a lot of Psalms? Your head goes this way. No, he wrote a couple. Psalm 127. For the most part, it's David, but there are some other authors as well. How about Proverbs? Ah, Solomon. David didn't write Proverbs. Why would Solomon be a pretty good guy to write wisdom literature? He was given the gift of wisdom. That's right. Didn't always live up to it, did he? What about others? Are there some others who have contributed to the Proverbs that we know of? The great poem there at the end, the men sure like it. I don't know if the women like the worthy women poem, that ideal. I will never, by the way, I will never preach a Mother's Day sermon on Proverbs 31. I'm not here to make moms mad. Oh, she is presented as such an ideal. And it is a beautiful poem. I don't know that Solomon wrote it, as much as I would like to credit the king of Israel. Rather, the way it's presented to us, that there at the end goes with Lemuel, Lemuel, and the wisdom he received from his mother. So there are other authors besides that. Tell me about Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. We think, the Song of Solomon, the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's, and Ecclesiastes identifies its author as the king of Israel, the son of David. It never specifically names Solomon, which is curious, something to think about. All right, Job. We don't know who wrote it, but when we come to the book of Job, what is the part of Job that we are all so familiar with? The beginning and the end, the prologue and the epilogue. You see there on the chart, what is characteristic of the first two chapters and then this last major section, 42, the epilogue, 42:7 through the end? What I'm trying to get at is they are prose, they are narrative. We are much more comfortable, at least I am, talking about prose. If Jolene were here, I've talked to her and Walker, because they're weird. They like poetry. That's just not something I'm really into. I wish I were, because when I read a poem and understand it, I really appreciate it. It just has to be explained to me 17 times before I finally, oh, okay, that's what's going on. We are very familiar with Job 1 and 2, and then the epilogue. What happens in the prologue? What happens to poor Job? He's a wealthy man, isn't he? And he has all of that taken away. And we are privy to the behind-the-scenes conversation between the adversary, Satan, as he's called, and God, the Lord. God permits the adversary to take everything away from Job. Does Job know that this conversation took place in the heavenly realm? He is unaware of it. We as readers understand what Job does not. That's called irony, dramatic irony, when we know what's going on, but the characters do not, and they're having to grapple with this. And Job has some friends who, in Job's distress, they come to talk to him. So we're going to spend a little more time with Job because we don't talk about it as much. And who are those three buddies? Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. What did Job think about his friends? I hear a scoff. They were not. I love this verse. I've heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. That's how Job felt. What was his physical condition as he's talking with his buddies? He's got sores all over his bodies. He's had to take pottery and break it apart and break open the sores to relieve them. What about mentally? Besides his health being broken, he's lost his family. Discouragement doesn't even begin to describe how badly he feels here. Here's another, this is actually a paraphrase. I've had all I can take of your talk. What a bunch of miserable comforters. So I like that. There is another character, though. There is a fourth person, and he comes at the end, and we'll see that here in just a second, Elihu. So you've got these older men, and they're gonna talk with Job. They all take turns, and then you have the Elihu who has a speech. And a lot of times when we read the Bible, we're looking for truth. We're looking for God's divine revelation. I tell you, all four of these men make some erroneous statements about life, about God's justice, and that's something we need to keep in mind whenever we're studying this. Let me show you the basic structure of Job. Once you get into chapter 3, and chapter 3 is where Job is just saying, woe is me, life is horrible, I wish I hadn't been born. That's what he goes on to say. And then you have these friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and they alternate. So Eliphaz responds to Job's speech. He says, no, Job, that's just not good. That's not right. And they all respond. That's cycle number 1 in chapters 3 through 11. And I know you can find this. I don't know if I have this in the material on the big picture. I don't know if I walked through. I think I did. I think I just gave a basic outline. But then you've got chapters 12 through 20. And there's some other, I mean, this is just a simplistic look at this, but this is what happens. So you've got that same pattern. Let me go back. You've got Job, Eliphaz, Job, Bildad, Job, Zophar. It happens again. Cycle number 2. That's just something to keep in mind when you're ready to study it. And then cycle 3, it's Job, Eliphaz, Job, Bildad, Job, and then nothing from Zophar. I don't know why, but there's nothing at that point. Job has 42 chapters, so we're getting near to the end. And I'm going to point out to you Job 28. This is Job's speech in chapter 28. And it's a beautiful poem. I mean, all of this is poetry here, and it's about wisdom. Where does wisdom come from? Verse 12, where shall wisdom be found? Where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its worth, and it is not found in the land of the living. The deep says, it is not in me. And the sea says, it is not in me. You don't read that kind of language in narrative normally. This is poetic, where you have these entities, these concepts that are speaking. It cannot be bought for gold. Silver cannot be weighed as its price. This is a really good poem about wisdom. Why does Job want wisdom? Why does he want to buy some wisdom? Because he doesn't understand what's happening to him. He does not understand at all why all this has unfolded. And so I know we're going through this very, very quickly, but there's a lot here. And on my chart there, I've got Job, Elihu starting to speak in chapter 29. Job continues in chapter 29. I messed up there. Tell me about chapters 38 through 42. So instead of Zophar, you have Elihu step in and speak. And this is the only time he speaks. And he says some things that are, quite frankly, we need to be careful with because it is erroneous. 32, that's where his speech starts. I need to correct that. Elihu is rebuking not only Job, saying, no, Job, you're wrong about God and your understanding of evil and suffering, but he also chastises these older men. So what's the idea here? Somebody young who thinks he's got it all figured out, telling these older men, no, you got it all wrong. Has that ever played out? Just the same song, just another verse of life? Because these men, why are they struggling so much? Why are these 3 friends of Job struggling with the idea that their friend, who is claiming to be righteous, has had all this bad stuff happen to him? Yes, sir. Okay, so Job, they think, is lying about his righteousness. What are we privy to, though, in Job chapter 1? I should have mentioned this. What does it say in the very first verse? Job was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. His friends come and say, oh, you're suffering, Job. You need to confess your sin to God. Now, I don't think Job's claiming to be perfectly sinless, but he's a righteous man, and bad stuff is happening to him. And Job's three friends are terrified because they're saying, if Job is really a righteous man, and all this bad stuff has happened to him, then what? It can happen to me too. That's terrifying, isn't it? And what the book of Job, among other things, is struggling with is, how can we be guaranteed that nothing bad is going to happen to us? What's the answer? There is no guarantee. There is no guarantee at all. Now, are Job's friends correct that Job is a vile sinner and that's why all these bad things have happened to him? Absolutely not. How do we know that? Well, Job 1 verse 1 and Job 38 through 42. Who comes and speaks to Job and his friends? God himself. If you have never read Job much, I mean, this is not a book we just gravitate to. It's Old Testament, and why would we do that? There are people who love literature, who aren't Bible students. They love the book of Job, though, because it grapples in philosophical ways with the inequities of life. And Job 38 through 42, you got to read that if you haven't. And look at God's power on display as he talks about all that he has done and what he has made. His sarcasm, where he says, hey, Job, I created everything. Where were you when I was doing that? Where were you? And just kind of bitingly talks about this. All right, so let's look at some verses here. I've got them on the screen. Job 1, the end of Job 1, after all of his possessions are taken away. His health isn't broken until chapter 2. But in Job 1, after all his livestock, all of his money, it wasn't physical money, but livestock, and what else was taken from him? His 10 children. The devil killed Job's 10 children. This is what he says. It says, the text tells us that he tore his robe, shaved his head, fell on the ground, and worshiped. And he said, naked came I from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. Wow. Do you think that could have been you in that situation? What is Job known for? When we think of Job, we think of the word patience. And that's because in James 5, it talks about, well, and other places in the Bible talk about Job, but James 5 especially, it says, you know of the patience of Job. And that's the King James, New King James rendering of a word that more often is translated in our more modern versions as endurance or steadfastness. Is Job just sitting around? When I think of somebody who's patient, all kinds of noises and distractions and all kinds of really inconvenient problems going on. You're just sitting there twiddling your thumb saying, la-ti-da-ti-da-da, it's okay, it's all right. You got these kids running around screaming and a mom just so quiet and patient. Is that the idea here of Job just sitting around twiddling his thumbs, being quiet and taking it all in? Does Job question why this is all happening to him? And I really think it's more the idea of endurance. Job is not patient in the sense that he's just sitting around doing nothing, saying, oh, well, this is all okay. Here is one of the more well-known passages, Job 19. Job 19. In these verses, what you see is Job questioning, why is this happening to me? But at the same time, where is his trust? Let's read this. For I know, this is Job talking, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself. My eyes shall behold, and not another. my heart faints within me. Is Job in these verses saying, everything's great, life's super, never mind all this pain and agony I'm in? That's not what he's saying. He's not happy about the plight that he is facing. But what is he saying? Despite all the pain and the suffering and the problems, despite all of that, what? He stays faithful. He trusts in God. And that's a big help for us. I hope none of us suffer as terribly as Job did. And a lot of times my suffering is going to be because I did do something wrong, something dumb. In the case of Job, he was upright. This is a powerful book, and we would do well to study it. But it is difficult because we struggle with poetry. At least I do. I'm going to switch over to the book of Psalms, and I've got this quote from a book, and I mentioned this in the notes that are out in the foyer. But here's a really good quote. It's got a different cover now. I put the modern cover in there, but I didn't change it here. Here's the quote from a very conservative evangelical scholar. His name is Tremper Longman III. The Psalms are rich with images. So we're switching now to the Psalms. The Psalms are rich with images. Think for a moment about the many ways in which God is described in the Psalms. He is a shield, a fortress, a rock, a storm cloud, a shepherd, a warrior, an archer, a chariot rider, a king, and so much more. And then he says this, unless we understand how imagery works, we will miss much of the message of the Psalms. So let's take a look at one, and I know this is just a quick sample. How many Psalms are there, by the way? 150 Psalms. That's a lot of Psalms. It makes it sound like it's a pretty long book. Is it long? Yeah, it's the longest book in the Bible. All these Psalms, these poems. I hope you can see that there. Let me read the first 4 verses of Psalm 114. And think about the imagery here. When Israel went out from Egypt, all right, it's describing them leaving Egypt, the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah became his sanctuary, Israel his dominion. They became God's covenant people. Verse 3, the sea looked and fled. Jordan turned back. The mountains skipped like rams, the hills like lambs. Now, do you think the Red Sea literally saw Moses coming with the Israelites and saying, I better get out of the way? What is this called when you have an inanimate object taking on human characteristics? Personification. I think I can spell that. Personification. And what is this referring to then? I already gave it away. The sea looked and fled. That's referring to the crossing of the Red Sea. Jordan turned back. What is that referring to? Okay, and I know you know this. In Joshua chapters 3 and 4, when Joshua performed the same exact miracle as Moses. So what was God doing when he had Joshua lead the nation through the Jordan River, opening up like the Red Sea had done previously? He is letting folks know, Moses, who has now died, Moses was my leader, Joshua is his successor, his true successor. And when they cross the Jordan, they're going from the east side of the Jordan into the Promised Land. That's when they actually, as a nation, enter into the land. And you have these mountains skipping like rams. Is that literal? No, it's metaphorical. It's poetic imagery. All right, how about Psalm 23? Just the first 3 verses. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Do you like those poetic lines? Is that pretty? The Lord is like my shepherd. Does it say that? If it had been like my shepherd, we would have called that a simile. But because he says the Lord is my shepherd, we call that a metaphor. All right, we talked about this some, and I know that's pretty basic English grammar. We understand that. What does it mean that the Lord is my shepherd? So all those images we were talking about earlier, a shield, warrior, archer. Well, here he's a shepherd. Probably one of the most famous images. What does that mean? If God is our shepherd, that makes us sheep. Is that a compliment? It can't be. And we could go on and talk about sheep. Rob, do you know anything about sheep? Have you written anything about it? Yeah, Rob wrote a chapter in a book talking about various animals. And the one he discussed was sheep. He knows a thing or two about animals. I shall not want. What does that mean? Because God is my shepherd, I shall not want. That means I have everything I need. And then he gives examples. He makes me lie down in green pastures. If I'm a little sheep, is that a good thing? I like green pastures. He leads me beside torrential waters, moving waters. Oh, no. What happens when the water is noisy and bubbly and a sheep walks up to that? Oh, no, I don't want anything to do with that. I have chihuahuas, and they scare easily. I don't do it on purpose most of the time. Last night, our little dog, she had on her thunder vest. Didn't help much. She slept in the pantry. We tried to get her to sleep with us. Our daughter is home for the weekend. She missed her dad, so she wanted to come see me. And our little dog was very, very happy. I think she would say, Jenny is my shepherd. And she protects me, something like that. So these are poetic lines, and I hope we can appreciate that. There are numerous types of psalms. And when we did a study on Wednesday nights on the Psalms, we looked at some of these. There are psalms, you could almost say songs, S-O-N-G-S. I'm saying P-S-A-L-M-S, psalms of lament. There are psalms that the dominant theme is trust in God, psalms of thanksgiving, psalms of praise. There are some royal psalms. There aren't many of them where God is described as the king or he is establishing his king. There are a handful of wisdom psalms. Psalm 1, Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament his handiwork. The Lord, the word of the Lord, it describes the word of the Lord. Psalm 119, those are 3 of the wisdom psalms. There's a handful of others. When we discuss this in our class, I don't know if you remember this, which would you think, psalms, songs of praise, which would you think of these categories would be the most common genre of psalm? You would think praise. I tried to tee that up for you. Songs of praise. But which is it? Lament. The most common, even more than praise, and of course we're the ones classify them. The Bible doesn't say this is a psalm of praise, this is a psalm of wisdom. We're looking at the content and looking at them. You see these psalms of lament. Probably the most famous is Psalm 22. Psalm 22, words quoted by Jesus from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? What is that psalm saying? God, I feel like you've left me. That's Psalm 22. What is the very next psalm? Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. How do you balance that? Psalm 22 verse 1 and Psalm 23 verse 1. You've forsaken me. Oh, no. No, you're my shepherd. How do you reconcile that? Do you ever feel like Psalm 22? I feel forsaken. I don't feel close to God at all. And then another time in your life, you feel close to God. Oh, he's my shepherd. Anybody? Of course. We all have ups and downs in our lives, don't we? And what happens to us affects our happiness, our level of joy. What is the answer? Has God forsaken us? When we feel forsaken, okay, it's us who have left him. James 4, verse 8, draw near to God, and he will think about drawing near to you. He'll consider it. What does it say? If you draw near to God, he will draw near to you. What is it that separates us from God? Sin? We ourselves separate ourselves from him. I had some charts here on examples, but we're not going to look at that. I do need to mention this. What is interesting is the Psalms are divided up into 5 books. And I mentioned Psalms 1 through 72, actually. Psalms 1 through 72. Most of these are written by David. You then start in book 3. You have 17 Psalms in book 3, 17 Psalms in book 4. It's rather apparent these have been arranged on purpose. Sometimes we get the idea that the songs are just thrown together. And scholars have begun to understand these are organized a little more carefully than we might at first think. So that's something to think about. Another really important idea we need to just briefly mention is how so many of these Psalms refer to Jesus. These Psalms written by David would be 1,000 years before him. And then others of these Psalms are written several hundred years before Jesus. And yet, so many of these Psalms refer to Jesus. Psalm 16 is quoted in Psalm 2 by Peter, as well as, did I say Psalm 2? Acts 2. Acts 2 by Peter and Acts 13 by Paul. And they talk about Jesus' resurrection. They have pierced my hands and my feet, David talks about in Psalm 22. And that is fulfilled in Jesus' crucifixion. Even the garments of Jesus being divided up. And the Psalms do mention Jesus, or the idea of the one who was being persecuted. Psalm 34, not a bone of him was broken. I am impressed with this because how could some of these Psalms be so specific in describing details of Jesus' crucifixion specifically when they were written hundreds of years before? Now, in the original context, the psalmist is lamenting something he's facing in his life, but they find fulfillment, fascinatingly, they find fulfillment in Jesus. All right, the book of Proverbs, we're surveying, we're trying to go quickly. Proverbs, we need to study Proverbs in more detail. When you think of a proverb, what do you typically conjure up in your mind? Long essays or short? What are some proverbs we know in our culture? A penny saved is a penny earned. A stitch in time saves 9. What's neat about that little proverb, besides that it's true? But it's short and pithy, and it rhymes, sort of. Stitch in time saves 9. How about some biblical proverbs? A soft answer turns away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. Some simple poems. In chapters 1 through 9, you have the essays. You have these longer descriptions of wisdom and folly, for example. But then starting in chapter 10, Proverbs 10, verse 1, it says the Proverbs of Solomon. And it has, starting there, a lot of these one-line psalms. A wise man makes a father glad, but his foolish son is a sorrow to his mother. That's a proverb. And then you go on to a different topic, and you're familiar with that. Toward the end, you have some longer than one sentence. And so my chart's not entirely accurate there because you do have a mix and match. Here is the prologue to the book of Proverbs. Verses 1, 2, and then verses 1 through 7 are the prologue. Here's verses 1, 2, and 7 on the screen. The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel. Now, Solomon didn't write all the Proverbs. But why is he writing this? To help you know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight. And then here's kind of the thesis of the book, Proverbs 1, verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. So what is verse 7 inviting us to do as we read the book of Proverbs? Get wisdom. If you think you already have wisdom, well, I'm going to help you gain even more. But if you're naive and simple, you really need to learn wisdom. And this concept of the fear of the Lord being the beginning of knowledge is repeated a handful of times in the book of Proverbs. So this serves as a really good outline. Let me give you some examples of some of these short ones. I already read Proverbs 15:1. Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. You see how the two lines parallel each other? You still have this parallelism even in the poetry. Let me ask you this. Here's one more on the screen. Are Proverbs intended to be true and exact in every situation? And one of the ones we turn to is Proverbs 22, verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and that guarantees when he gets old, he will not depart from it. Can you, as a good parent, do the best job you can, bring up your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, and they grow up and say, you know what, forget all that? Is the opposite also true, that you can be a reprobate, and your kid grow up and say, I want a better life. I'm going to serve the Lord. Okay. Are the Proverbs intended to be axiomatic? What is interesting is you have some elements of that in the Proverbs where it's saying now, you know, life isn't all black and white. But the book of Job really helps us to see that, doesn't it? The inequities of life. It really helps to illustrate that. As does, come on, Mark, we're going to have to go on to Ecclesiastes, as does the book of Ecclesiastes. How many of you have studied the book of Ecclesiastes? I know you guys have. Tell me about it. Tell me about Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. We're going to have to be real quick here. But is Ecclesiastes about how life is just so simple? And if you just do exactly what God tells you to do, everything will turn out great. Now, in theory, I like that. That's what Job's friends thought. Job, something wrong here because you're in bad shape and you must have done something horrible to deserve all this. What does Ecclesiastes say? Is the race always to the swift? I mean, I may make the world's best brisket, and it is super duper delicious. And I should have come home with the first prize. The race is not always to the swift. I'm trying to finish that. The battle to the strong. Sometimes Rocky's going to win. David and Goliath. David won. Goliath should have won that. No. There's more behind the scenes here. What is the key word in the book of Ecclesiastes? Vanity. I got it on the screen there. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. And one of the important concepts in the book of Ecclesiastes is life isn't fair. Working hard doesn't guarantee happiness. There it is. The fastest runner doesn't always win the race, Ecclesiastes 9 through 11. What is one of the most famous passages? Ecclesiastes 3. Ecclesiastes 3, where it says there's a time for everything. And the 1960 song by the Byrds is based on that. Another famous passage in Ecclesiastes, I'm not expecting you to remember all this. It's in the material, the big picture, where we survey this. But the 3 R's in Ecclesiastes 11:9, 11:10, and chapter 12, verse 1. Now, we call them the 3 R's because that works in English. I don't think Solomon was intending that. But rejoice, remove, remember. Rejoice, remove, remember. Wisdom for those of us who are young in life. When you are young, when you're a teenager, when you don't have bills to pay, that is the best time to be alive. Because what happens when you get married and you have kids? Life takes on a whole new complexity, doesn't it? And it's not that life can't be enjoyable, but rejoice in your youth. And then you have the last 2 verses of Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiastes 12, 13, and 14. What is the end of the matter? Even with all life's inequities and all the problems that we face, what is the ultimate goal, purpose of our lives? What is it? Fear God and keep his commandments. In the book of Ecclesiastes, he talks a lot about life under the sun. What does that mean? Here on earth. Is everything fair in our sin-sick world? Do good things happen to bad people sometimes? Do bad things happen to good people? Under the sun, bad things happen. When we don't have God in the picture at all, life is going to seem worthless, vanity of vanities. But what is he telling us? We're not here without God. We're not alone. And while we may not always understand everything, we need to have the trust that if we serve God and are faithful to him, and I do hope at some point to study the book of Ecclesiastes with you in a Bible class setting. It's a marvelous book. The problem is I'm still struggling with it. I'm still trying to figure it all out, figure out the whole Bible. All right, I'm out of time. Song of Solomon, it's probably best we didn't get to it anyway. It's about love. And I'm sorry we didn't get to that. Next week we're going to talk about the prophets. We've got one more lesson next week, and then we're going to have a review. We're going to play a little game, see how smart everybody is. Thank you for your observation and participation this morning.